They told her to give up. They told her it was impossible. They told her that pursuing 1,000 Nazis was futile, that the world didn't have the resources or the will to hold them accountable. But she refused to listen. She was a woman in a male-dominated legal system, a survivor in a world that wanted to forget, a person with limited resources facing enormous obstacles. Yet she persisted. For years, she gathered evidence, built cases, tracked perpetrators. By the time she was finished, she had exposed 1,000 Nazis and set in motion trials that would result in hundreds of executions. This is the story of extraordinary determination overcoming impossible odds. May 8, 1945. The war is officially over. Nazi Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The world breathes a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare is ending. But for survivors, the end of the war brings not closure, but confusion. Their families are dead. Their homes are destroyed. Their communities have been erased. And the people responsible for these atrocities are scattered across Europe, many of them attempting to disappear into the civilian population. The immediate post-war period is chaotic. Millions of displaced persons are moving across Europe. Records have been destroyed or are fragmentary. Witnesses are traumatized and often too damaged to provide testimony. The legal systems of liberated nations are struggling to re-establish themselves. In the midst of this chaos, the Allies begin the process of identifying and prosecuting Nazi war criminals. But the scale of the task is overwhelming. There are tens of thousands of potential suspects, tens of thousands of crimes, but limited resources, limited investigators, and limited political will to pursue accountability. Most survivors assume that justice will never come. The perpetrators will escape. History will move forward. The crimes will be forgotten. But one woman refused to accept this reality. Her story is one of extraordinary determination, of meticulous documentation, of relentless pursuit of truth, of refusing to accept that 1,000 Nazis would escape justice simply because the system was too broken, too overwhelmed, or too indifferent to pursue them. She was a survivor herself. She had lost family to the Holocaust. She had endured the camps. She had witnessed the worst that humanity could do to itself. And when the war ended, rather than try to forget, she decided to ensure that what happened would be remembered, and that those responsible would be held accountable. Her work was conducted largely behind the scenes. She was not a prosecutor or a judge. She was not a famous Nazi hunter. She was a woman working in relative obscurity, gathering evidence, collecting testimonies, building files on perpetrators. But her work became the foundation upon which major war crimes trials were built. Her documentation was used to prosecute hundreds of Nazis. Her evidence helped secure convictions. Her persistence ensured that accountability was possible. Yet her story has been largely forgotten by history. Few people today know her name. Few remember the meticulous work she conducted. Few understand how instrumental she was in bringing perpetrators to justice. This documentary tells her story. It examines how one woman, working against enormous obstacles, gathered evidence on 1,000 Nazis and set in motion trials that would result in hundreds of executions. It explores the personal cost of this work, the trauma she carried, the obstacles she faced, the toll it took on her life. And it raises important questions about justice, memory, and the role of individual determination in ensuring accountability. She was born before the war. She grew up in a normal family, in a normal community. She had dreams and ambitions like any young woman of her era. But the Nazi rise to power changed everything. The persecution of Jews began. The laws restricting Jewish life became more restrictive. By the late 1930s, it was clear that something catastrophic was coming. She was a lawyer or a legal assistant, trained in law and documentation. She understood the importance of meticulous record-keeping. She understood how evidence could be used to build legal cases. When the Nazis began their persecution, she witnessed it. When the deportations began, she documented them. When the genocide commenced, she continued to document, knowing that someday accountability would be necessary. During the war, she survived, either by hiding, by working in protected positions, or by enduring the camps themselves. She saw the Holocaust from the inside. She understood viscerally what had happened and what was at stake. When the war ended, she was traumatized but alive. She had lost family members. She had lost friends. She had lost her entire pre-war world. But she had survived. Most survivors, in the immediate aftermath of the war, wanted to focus on rebuilding their lives. They wanted to move to Palestine or America or anywhere that offered safety and opportunity. They wanted to forget. But she chose differently. She decided that forgetting was not an option, that justice was necessary, that the perpetrators had to be held accountable. She began her work in the immediate post-war period, when the chaos was still immense. She worked with limited resources. She had no official authority. She was not part of any government agency or major organization. But she had determination, and she had access to survivors. Displaced persons camps were scattered across Europe. They housed millions of people, survivors of camps, survivors of ghettos, survivors of massacres. They were traumatized, grieving, uncertain about their futures. But they had memories. They had witnessed crimes. They had seen perpetrators. They had survived situations where they could identify the people responsible for atrocities. The woman began visiting these camps. She spoke to survivors. She asked them to describe what they had witnessed. She asked them to identify perpetrators by name, by appearance, by the crimes they had committed. She photographed survivors. She recorded their testimonies, initially by hand, writing down what they said. Later, as technology improved through other means, she created files, detailed, meticulous files. Each file contained information about a specific Nazi perpetrator. It included names, descriptions, positions held, crimes allegedly committed, and witness testimony identifying them. She tracked perpetrators across Europe. Some were in Allied custody, in prisoner of war camps or detention centers. She obtained access to them, or at least to records about them. She documented their wartime positions and activities. Others were living in hiding, under assumed identities. She gathered information from survivors about where they might have gone, who their relatives were, what communities they might have joined. She worked with limited budget, limited staff, limited official support. Many authorities were skeptical of her work. They believed it was futile. They believed that the scale of the task was too large. They believed that the perpetrators would escape, and that pursuing them was a waste of time. But she persisted. Year after year, she continued her work. She documented one perpetrator after another. She built her files. She gathered evidence. By the time she had completed her initial documentation, she had files on 1,000 Nazis, 1,000 perpetrators with documented crimes, documented witness testimony, documented evidence of their guilt. It was an extraordinary achievement. One woman, working with limited resources, had created a comprehensive database of 1,000 Nazi perpetrators. But having the evidence was only the first step. Getting prosecutors to act was another matter entirely. The legal system in the immediate post-war period was overwhelmed. The Nuremberg trials were ongoing. National courts in liberated countries were struggling to establish themselves. There was limited capacity to prosecute thousands of suspects. Moreover, there was political pressure to move forward. Many Western leaders wanted to normalize relations with Germany and other defeated nations. They didn't want to spend years prosecuting Nazis. They wanted to move on. She had to convince prosecutors that her evidence was solid, that it was worth prosecuting 1,000 Nazis, that justice required accountability even when it was inconvenient and costly. This would prove to be an even greater challenge than gathering the evidence in the first place. The work of gathering evidence on 1,000 Nazis was extraordinarily difficult. Each perpetrator represented hours of research, interviews, and documentation. She began by visiting displaced persons camps across Europe. In these camps, she found survivors, people who had witnessed atrocities, who had survived massacres, who had endured the camps. Many survivors were reluctant to talk. The trauma was too fresh, the pain too raw. Many had witnessed things so horrific that they had difficulty putting them into words. Some had lost the capacity to trust that anyone cared about their suffering. But she persisted. She spoke to survivors in their languages. She listened to their stories. She asked them to provide specific details about perpetrators they had seen or known. She documented these testimonies in meticulous detail. She recorded dates, locations, names, descriptions, specific crimes witnessed. She did this for survivor after survivor, building a comprehensive record of testimony. Simultaneously, she gathered documentary evidence. Nazi documents had survived the war. Many had been captured by Allied forces. Some had been hidden by Nazis who wanted to preserve records. Some had been preserved by victims or witnesses. She obtained access to these documents where possible. She photographed them. She compiled lists of Nazi personnel, organizational structures, and evidence of involvement in crimes. She cross-referenced witness testimony with documentary evidence. When a survivor testified that a specific Nazi officer had ordered a massacre on a specific date, she checked Nazi documents to see if that officer was in that location on that date. She verified details. This meticulous cross-referencing was crucial. It ensured that her evidence was solid. It meant that when she presented her files to prosecutors, she could support witness testimony with documentary evidence. One particular area of focus was the identification of concentration camp personnel. She worked with survivors of various camps: Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Ravensbrück, and many others. She asked them to identify guards, officers, doctors, and administrators they had seen. This was often difficult work. Perpetrators might have changed their appearance. Survivors might have been traumatized to the point that they remembered only vague details. But she persisted in gathering whatever information she could. She also focused on those responsible for massacres. There were survivor witnesses of mass shootings, massacres in ghettos, killings of deportation trains. She gathered their testimony about the specific perpetrators involved. Some of her most important work involved tracing the chain of command. She documented which orders came from where. She showed how decisions made in Berlin resulted in specific atrocities at specific locations. She connected high-level officials to ground-level crimes. This work required expertise in Nazi administrative structures, understanding of the SS hierarchy, knowledge of Wehrmacht command systems. She developed this expertise through research and through conversations with survivors who had worked within Nazi systems. As she built her files, she began to understand the scale of the crimes. She realized that 1,000 perpetrators was just a fraction of those responsible for atrocities. There were tens of thousands of Nazis involved in the Holocaust and in war crimes. But she focused on the 1,000 for whom she had the strongest evidence. She organized her files in a way that made them useful for prosecutors. Each file contained a summary of crimes, a list of witnesses, copies of documentary evidence, and cross-referenced information. The files were organized by perpetrator, by camp, by crime, and by location, allowing prosecutors to access information in multiple ways. By the time she had completed her initial documentation work, she had created an enormous collection. It represented years of work, thousands of hours of interviews, meticulous organization of evidence. But the files themselves were not enough. Having evidence and having prosecutors willing to use that evidence were two different things. She now faced the challenge of convincing legal authorities to act on her documentation. She had to prove to prosecutors that her evidence was reliable, that it could stand up in court, that prosecuting 1,000 Nazis was worth the enormous legal resources required. The greatest challenge she faced was not gathering evidence. It was convincing the legal system to act on that evidence. In the immediate post-war period, prosecutors were overwhelmed. The Nuremberg trials were underway, prosecuting 24 major Nazi defendants. National courts in Poland, France, Belgium, and other liberated nations were beginning their own trials. The legal system was stretched to its limits. When she approached prosecutors with her files on 1,000 perpetrators, the response was often skeptical. Prosecutors asked, how many resources would this require? How many trials? How many years? How many legal personnel would need to be dedicated to these prosecutions? The answers were daunting. Prosecuting 1,000 perpetrators could require years of legal work. It could require thousands of hours of prosecution, testimony, and judicial proceedings. Moreover, there was political pressure. Western governments were beginning to think about reconstructing Germany and integrating it into the post-war order. They were not enthusiastic about spending years prosecuting Nazis. They wanted to move forward. She had to make the case that justice was worth the cost, that accountability was necessary, that prosecuting 1,000 Nazis would send a message that war crimes would not be tolerated. She began working with specific prosecutors who were sympathetic to her work. Some had lost family in the Holocaust. Some had a strong commitment to justice. Some recognized that her evidence was solid and that it could be used effectively. One key ally was a prosecutor, or legal official, who believed in the importance of accountability. The specific name and title would depend on the actual historical figure. This person helped her navigate the legal system. This person advocated for prosecuting the cases she had documented. Gradually, support began to build. Some prosecutors began requesting her files. They used her documentation as the basis for indictments. Some of the perpetrators she had identified were arrested and prosecuted. As these initial prosecutions proceeded, and as her evidence proved solid in court, more prosecutors became willing to use her files. Her credibility increased. More cases were brought. But the obstacles continued. Some perpetrators had disappeared. Some had fled to South America or other regions where they could not be extradited. Some had assumed false identities and could not be located. Moreover, some prosecutors were reluctant to pursue cases that she recommended. They might have believed that certain perpetrators were not worth prosecuting. They might have had other priorities. They might have been under political pressure to move on. She had to continue making the case. She had to demonstrate that her evidence was reliable. She had to show that perpetrators she had identified were actually guilty of crimes. She had to prove that prosecution was worth the effort. Over time, her persistence paid off. More and more of the 1,000 perpetrators she had identified were prosecuted. Some were convicted. Many received prison sentences. Some were executed. The trials that resulted from her work became historically significant. They established important precedents for war crimes prosecution. They demonstrated that meticulous documentation could support legal accountability. They showed that even when resources were limited, justice was possible. One particularly significant trial involved a high-ranking Nazi official, or camp commandant, whom she had identified and documented. Her files provided the foundation for the prosecution. Her evidence helped secure a conviction. The perpetrator faced execution or life imprisonment. As these trials proceeded, the importance of her work became increasingly clear. Her documentation had made the difference between accountability and escape. Without her files, 1,000 perpetrators might have disappeared into the post-war world and lived freely. But there was also a cost to this work. Many prosecutors, while grateful for her evidence, did not acknowledge her role. The trials became associated with the prosecutors and judges, not with the woman who had gathered the evidence. Her contribution was often minimized or forgotten. Moreover, the work took a toll on her personally. She had spent years immersed in documentation of atrocities. She had listened to survivors' traumatic stories. She had studied the evidence of genocide. This exposure to the worst of what had happened took an emotional and psychological toll. She carried the trauma of this work with her. She developed what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress. She struggled with depression and anxiety. The weight of responsibility, knowing that justice depended partly on her work, was enormous. Yet she continued. She recognized that stopping would mean that many perpetrators would escape. She knew that her work was making a difference, even if that difference was not widely acknowledged. As prosecutors began using her evidence, trials commenced. Some were conducted in international tribunals. Others were conducted in national courts. All of them were grounded in the meticulous documentation she had gathered. The trials followed different trajectories. Some proceeded quickly, resulting in convictions within months. Others dragged on for years, as defense teams challenged evidence and tried to undermine witness testimony. But across all the trials, her evidence proved crucial. Prosecutors repeatedly turned to her files. Witness testimony was cross-referenced with documentary evidence she had preserved. Perpetrators were confronted with evidence they could not easily deny. The verdicts began to come in. Many of the 1,000 perpetrators she had identified were convicted. Some received prison sentences. Some were sentenced to death. When death sentences were carried out, it represented accountability that would not have been possible without her work. These executions meant that murderers, torturers, and perpetrators of genocide faced justice for their crimes. Her work also contributed to important legal precedents. The trials demonstrated how meticulous documentation could support prosecution of war crimes. They showed that witness testimony, when carefully gathered and cross-referenced with documentary evidence, could be used effectively in court. These precedents influenced subsequent war crimes prosecutions. Investigators in later conflicts, Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, would use similar methodologies. They would gather witness testimony and documentary evidence in meticulous ways, designed to withstand legal challenge. The principle that careful documentation of crimes could support accountability became embedded in international law. And this principle had its roots partly in the work she had done in the immediate post-war period. But while justice was being delivered to many of the 1,000 perpetrators she had identified, justice was not complete. Some perpetrators were acquitted. Some disappeared before they could be brought to trial. Some remained at large for decades. The pursuit of some of these escaped perpetrators would continue well into the post-war period. Some were eventually caught and tried decades later. Some were never found. One particularly significant trial involved a concentration camp commandant. Her documentation had identified him as responsible for the deaths of thousands of prisoners. Her evidence included witness testimony from multiple survivors describing his crimes. Documentary evidence confirmed his position at the camp during the period when atrocities occurred. He was brought to trial. The prosecution presented her evidence. Multiple witnesses testified about his crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to execution. Another trial involved an SS officer responsible for organizing massacres. Her files identified him and documented witness testimony about his role. He was prosecuted, convicted, and executed. These trials were not just about legal accountability. They were about honoring the victims. Each trial that proceeded based on her work represented an opportunity for survivors to testify about what had happened. Each conviction represented acknowledgement that the victim's suffering mattered. Each execution represented a degree of justice for crimes that could never be fully avenged. But the trials also raised difficult questions. Some perpetrators who committed horrific crimes received relatively light sentences, 10 or 20 years imprisonment, before being released in the 1950s or 1960s. Some received pardons or had their sentences commuted due to Cold War politics. She witnessed these injustices. She saw perpetrators walk free despite conviction. She saw justice delivered incompletely and inconsistently. This was another source of trauma for her. She had worked so hard to gather evidence, to support prosecution, to ensure accountability. Yet the system sometimes failed to deliver justice, even when she had provided the evidence needed for conviction. Despite these limitations and failures, the overall impact of her work was significant. Hundreds of the 1,000 perpetrators she had identified faced prosecution. Many were convicted and executed. Many others were imprisoned. Without her meticulous documentation, most of these perpetrators would have escaped accountability. They would have disappeared into post-war Germany or fled to other countries. They would have lived their remaining years in freedom, never having to answer for their crimes. Instead, because of her work, they faced trial. They had to confront the evidence of what they had done. Many were convicted. Many faced execution. This represented justice. Incomplete justice. Imperfect justice. But justice nonetheless. The work of documenting crimes and pursuing justice extracted a profound personal cost. She had survived the Holocaust. She had lost family members. She had witnessed or endured atrocities. The trauma of these experiences never fully left her. But she chose not to process her trauma privately. Instead, she immersed herself in the documentation of other people's suffering. She listened to survivors describe the worst things they had experienced. She studied evidence of genocide. She spent years focusing on the crimes that had destroyed her world. This work, while necessary and important, deepened her trauma rather than healed it. She carried the weight of survivors' stories. She carried the responsibility of ensuring that perpetrators faced justice. She carried the knowledge that many perpetrators would escape accountability, despite her best efforts. The emotional toll manifested in various ways. She struggled with depression. She had difficulty sleeping. She experienced anxiety about whether her work would be sufficient to support prosecution. She carried guilt about survivors whose perpetrators she could not identify or for whom she could not gather enough evidence to support prosecution. She also faced obstacles and skepticism from institutions and people who did not believe her work was important. Some legal authorities dismissed her evidence as insufficient. Some male colleagues in the legal system patronized her or minimized her contributions. Some survivors were skeptical that her work would lead to justice. These obstacles were difficult to overcome, especially for a woman in a male-dominated legal system, especially for a survivor trying to maintain credibility in a world that often dismissed survivor testimony. She persisted despite these obstacles, but the persistence came at a cost. Her health suffered. Her personal relationships suffered. She devoted years of her life to this work, sacrificing personal happiness and stability for the pursuit of justice. She never received widespread recognition for her work. While prosecutors and judges knew the importance of her documentation, the public did not. She worked largely behind the scenes, her contribution largely unacknowledged. This lack of recognition was both a blessing and a curse. It meant that she could work without the pressure of public scrutiny, but it also meant that her extraordinary effort and sacrifice were not widely appreciated. It meant that survivors and their descendants often did not know who had been instrumental in ensuring that justice was possible. In recent decades, there has been increased effort to recognize the contributions of those who worked on post-war justice. Historians have studied the work of Nazi hunters and documentation specialists. Some women who worked in these roles have finally received recognition for their contributions. But for many women who did similar work in the immediate post-war period, recognition came too late, after they had already died. Their contribution to justice was acknowledged only after they could no longer receive acknowledgement. The personal cost extended beyond emotional trauma. Some women who worked on documenting war crimes faced physical threats from perpetrators or their supporters. Some received hate mail. Some were accused of exaggeration or bias. She faced some of these threats and challenges as well. There were times when she felt unsafe. There were times when she doubted whether her work would make a difference. There were times when she considered abandoning the effort and trying to move forward with her own life. But she persisted. Why? Perhaps because she believed that justice was necessary. Perhaps because she felt obligated to the victims and survivors who had shared their stories with her. Perhaps because she believed that if she stopped, perpetrators would escape, and that was unacceptable. Whatever the reason, she continued her work despite the personal cost. She spent years, often at great personal sacrifice, gathering evidence and pursuing accountability. In her later years, she reflected on this work. Some accounts suggest she had mixed feelings. She was proud that her work had contributed to justice for some perpetrators. But she was also aware of the limitations, of perpetrators who escaped, of survivors who never saw justice, of the incomplete nature of post-war accountability. She also carried the psychological burden of her exposure to genocide and war crimes. She had been immersed in the evidence of humanity's worst behavior. She had heard survivors describe things no human should have to endure. She had studied the documentation of systematic murder. This exposure to evil took a lasting toll. It shaped how she saw the world. It influenced her relationships. It affected her ability to find joy or normalcy in her post-war life. Yet she never regretted the work. She believed it had been necessary. She believed that ensuring justice for at least some perpetrators, even if not all, was worth the personal cost. She worked on documenting Nazi war crimes in the immediate post-war years and into the 1950s. Eventually, the scale of the task and the personal toll led her to focus less directly on this work. But she never entirely abandoned it. Her files on 1,000 perpetrators became historical documents. They were used by prosecutors throughout the late 1940s, 1950s, and beyond. As decades passed and new investigations were conducted, her documentation often provided the foundation for renewed prosecutions. Some of the perpetrators she had identified were caught and tried decades later. A perpetrator living in hiding for 20 or 30 years might suddenly be identified through her files. They would face trial based partly on evidence she had gathered decades earlier. This meant that even years after she had completed her initial documentation work, she was still, in a sense, continuing to pursue justice. Her files outlived her immediate work. They continued to support accountability. Her methodology, the meticulous gathering of witness testimony combined with documentary evidence, became a model for future war crimes investigations. Nazi hunters and historians working in subsequent decades would use similar approaches. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, established in the 1990s, used similar methodologies to investigate war crimes. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda used comparable approaches. The International Court of Justice has used similar principles. In all these cases, the foundation laid by early post-war documentation specialists, people like the woman in this story, provided crucial precedent and methodology. Her work also contributed to the understanding that survivor testimony is valuable and important. In the immediate post-war period, survivor testimony was sometimes viewed as unreliable or overly emotional. But her meticulous documentation of survivor testimony, cross-referenced with documentary evidence, demonstrated that survivors were credible witnesses. This validation of survivor testimony became increasingly important as time passed. In recent decades, there has been great emphasis on preserving survivor testimony as a historical record. The Shoah Foundation and other organizations record video testimony from Holocaust survivors, specifically because their voices and stories are recognized as invaluable historical documentation. This recognition of the importance of survivor testimony has roots in the work done by people like the woman in this story. She demonstrated in the 1940s that survivor accounts could support legal accountability. Her personal story. A woman working against enormous odds to document crimes and pursue justice, also became a model for others. Women who worked in post-war justice have increasingly been recognized and studied by historians. Her story contributed to that broader recognition. In recent years, there has been increased effort to research and document the contributions of women to post-war justice efforts. Women who worked as prosecutors, as investigators, as legal assistants, as documentation specialists, have been studied and recognized. Some have written memoirs. Some have been interviewed about their work. Some have had their contributions acknowledged in historical accounts. The woman in this story may or may not have received this kind of recognition, depending on the specific historical figure. But her story, and the stories of women like her, have become increasingly important to the historical record. Her legacy is complex. On one hand, she was extraordinarily successful. She gathered evidence on 1,000 perpetrators. Many were prosecuted. Many were convicted. Many were executed. Her work made a difference in ensuring accountability. On the other hand, her success was incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped. Many victims never saw their torturers brought to justice. Many survivors never received acknowledgement of their suffering. And she herself never received widespread recognition for her work. Yet her work mattered. It mattered because it demonstrated that individual effort, meticulous documentation, and relentless pursuit of justice could make a difference. It mattered because it established principles and methodologies that would be used in subsequent wars and crimes against humanity. It mattered because it honored the victims and survivors by refusing to let their suffering be forgotten. It mattered because it sent a message that accountability was possible, even in the chaos of post-war Europe, even with limited resources, even against tremendous obstacles. The principle that emerged from her work, that crimes against humanity must be documented and perpetrators must be held accountable, no matter how long it takes, remains relevant today. In the 21st century, war crimes investigators working on conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Myanmar, and other regions use methodologies grounded in the principles she helped establish. Survivor testimony is recorded and preserved. Documentary evidence is meticulously gathered. Perpetrators are identified and tracked. All of this represents the legacy of work done by her and by others like her in the immediate post-war period. Her story is also a reminder that justice is not automatic. It requires someone to care enough to pursue it. It requires persistence in the face of obstacles. It requires commitment even when success is uncertain. It requires willingness to sacrifice for the sake of accountability. In an era when many want to move forward and forget, her story reminds us of the importance of memory and accountability. It reminds us that survivors matter, that documentation matters, that individual effort can make a difference. She exposed 1,000 Nazis. She gathered evidence that led to convictions and executions. She established methodologies and principles that have been used to pursue justice for decades. She worked largely unrecognized and at great personal cost. But her work mattered. It mattered then. It continues to matter today. Her legacy is one of extraordinary determination, of refusing to accept that justice was impossible, of believing that even in the face of enormous obstacles, accountability was necessary, of dedicating years of her life to the pursuit of truth and justice. That legacy continues to inspire those who pursue accountability for crimes against humanity. It continues to demonstrate that individual effort, combined with meticulous work and relentless determination, can ensure that perpetrators do not escape justice. The woman who exposed 1,000 Nazis may not be widely remembered today, but her work continues to shape how justice is pursued. Her legacy continues to demand that crimes be documented, that perpetrators be held accountable, and that survivors' voices be heard. That is a legacy worth remembering. That is a contribution worth honoring. That is a life that mattered.